Salam, jumpa kembali di Jejak Papua Channel.
And it's a pleasure for me to be the moderator for today's program on addressing gender-based violence and environmental crimes in West Papua.
The first encounter with foreign colonizers was already in 1526 with the Portuguese. And they gave the name to the island, the Ilhas das Papuas. So there is the name Papua came from.
Colonial grievances and frustrated processes of colonization as we see it in West Papua, and how is that continuing to influence these violent dynamics targeting the indigenous communities in West Papua with particular harmful impact of the women in that society. So I'm not going to go into details because Fadir has gone through all of that. I just wanted to highlight that there is a very close connection between this frustrated process of decolonization and the current situation in West Papua.
In fact, last year it looked like there was a real surge. And that's been sustained in palm oil plantations. And actually, West Papua is one of the areas where the surge is the greatest. Probably Kalimantan and West Papua are the areas that Indonesia is earmarking for rapid development. So this is something that we've heard is crucially important. The Trans-Papuan Highway is a major area of conflict.
Sahabat, American Bar Association atau ABA, Asosiasi Pengacara Amerika, Bagian Hukum Pidana Internasional, menggelar program diskusi dengan fokus pada kekerasan berbasis gender, ekosida, dan kejahatan iklim yang terjadi di tanah Papua, serta tindakan yang diperlukan untuk menghentikan berlanjutnya kejahatan internasional. Program ini disponsori bersama oleh Komite Asia Selatan, Oseania, dan India, serta bekerjasama dengan Asosiasi Internasional Cendekiawan Genosida. Sahabat, perlu Anda ketahui bahwa ABA adalah sebuah organisasi profesi bagi para pengacara di Amerika Serikat. ABA didirikan pada tahun 1878 dan bertujuan untuk meningkatkan administrasi peradilan, mempromosikan program-program pendidikan hukum, dan membangun standar profesional bagi para pengacara. Organisasi ini juga terlibat dalam pengembangan kebijakan hukum dan advokasi isu-isu terkait hukum di berbagai tingkat, termasuk internasional. Sahabat, organisasi ini berkedudukan di Amerika Serikat dan hadir sebagai organisasi keanggotaan dan berkomitmen terhadap misinya membela kebebasan dan penegakan keadilan. Ditulis di laman ABA Internasional, sejak tahun 1960-an, diperkirakan 500.000 orang Papua telah dibunuh sejak Indonesia mengambil alih Papua Barat. Pelanggaran hak asasi manusia terus terjadi sejak saat itu, dilakukan oleh negara yang meliputi penangkapan sewenang-wenang terhadap pembela hak asasi manusia, pembunuhan di luar proses hukum, penyiksaan, dan penghilangan paksa. Selain bentuk-bentuk kejahatan tersebut, kekerasan berbasis gender dan kejahatan lingkungan hidup terus merajalela. Ditulis di laman itu, kekerasan antara pemerintah dan berbagai faksi menyebabkan sejumlah besar pengungsian internal, dan kekuatan militer menggunakan situasi tersebut terhadap faksi-faksi bersenjata sebagai dalih untuk menyakiti perempuan dan anak-anak tanpa pandang bulu. Dalam siklus tinjauan berkala universal tahun 2022, beberapa organisasi Papua melaporkan bahwa perempuan Papua mengalami interogasi yang kasar dan penyiksaan yang mengerikan saat ditahan oleh pasukan pemerintah. Tidak ada akuntabilitas dalam situasi ini. Selain itu, penambangan, penggundulan hutan, dan perampasan lahan yang dipicu oleh korporasi terus menyebabkan polusi dan telah menyebabkan kerusakan lingkungan pada hutan hujan, bakau, dan badan air. Sahabat, para pembicara pada presentasi ini adalah Sylvia Sevar, dosen dan peneliti hukum internasional publik The Hague University, Belanda. Kemudian Fajar Souten Korwa, pengacara hak asasi manusia Belanda. Dan pembicara berikutnya adalah David White, Profesor Keadilan Iklim, Gwen Mary University of London. Berikut video presentasi yang dimoderatori oleh Bruce Sagaris dari Washington, D.C., Amerika Serikat.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Bruce Zagaris, and it's a pleasure for me to be the moderator for today's program on addressing gender-based violence and environmental crimes in West Papua. We've got a great set of panelists. We're going to start off with Fajwa Shoten Korwa is going to explain the ongoing conflict and its colonial origins. She's going to be followed by Sylvia Shevar, who's going to reflect on patterns of gender-based violence in West Papua. And then she'll be followed by David White, Professor David White, who will give some reflections on the issues of climate justice in the context of what's going on in West Papua. So let me just briefly give the bios of our excellent panel. Fajwa is a lawyer who's registered at the Dutch bar. She has expertise in international law. She's an active advocate on the protection of human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples. Her ancillary activities include chairing the executive board of foundation cooperating organizations for West Papua, which is committed to safeguarding and promoting fundamental rights and freedoms of the people of West Papua. In particular, the right of Papuans to self-determination under international law. Fajwa is also the secretary of the executive board of the Stop Ekosida Foundation, which advocates and develops global cross-sector support on for an international crime of ecocide. Lastly, as member of the Environmental Commission of the Congress of Nations and States, she's part of the mission to seek to deliver unique contributions and solutions to foster relationships which are rooted in equality. Sylvia is a lecturer in public international law at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, which has the acronym THUOS. She also holds a researcher position at the chair of UN Studies in Peace and Justice, shared between Leiden University and THUOS. Her current research is focusing on environmentally fueled sexual violence against indigenous women, with a particular focus on the interaction between environmental factors, colonialism, and root causes of conflict. She was one of the contributing authors of the UN report Gender, Climate, and Security, coordinated by the UN Environmental Program. Sylvia worked with the UN-backed Special Court for Sierra Leone for several years as legal researcher. Her other professional activities included serving as registrar with the International People's Tribunal on Crimes Against Humanity in Indonesia, as well as chairing the working group International Protection of Human Rights of the Dutch section of the International Commission of Years. David White joined Queen Mary University of London from the University of Liverpool in 2022. He's the director of the Center for Climate Crime and climate justice. And I understand his group is doing some work on this issue. David teaches modules on climate justice and researching powerful organizations. David's research focuses on the relationship between law and corporate power. He has researched the regulation of business in a wide range of contexts, including working conditions, institutional fraud and corruption, economies of war and conflict, human rights, and ecocide. His current research focuses on legal responses to climate change, corporate accountability for climate change, and climate justice in the workplace. So each of our panelists will speak for 10 to 12 minutes. If you want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll try to call on you in the Q&A period. So without further ado, let me turn the program over to Fajar.
Thank you, Bruce, for this kind introduction, and thank you to the ADA International Criminal Law Committee and its sponsors to give me the opportunity to talk about West Papua. Most of the time, there's not much awareness about West Papua and its whereabouts, so that's where I will start. So maybe we can go to the next slide. West Papua is located on the western half of the island of New Guinea, here in red marked, and it's now it's today's Indonesia's sixth most eastern provinces. On the eastern half of the island is located Papua New Guinea, which gained independence in 1975, and most of the time it's also confused with West Papua. Next slide, please. The island of New Guinea is the second largest island after Greenland. And as you can see, it's quite large. It could cover the state of New York and even further. It has a unique biodiversity. It's also has the largest rainforest after the Amazon and Congo. However, this unique nature and habitat is endangered, and the reason for that is unfortunately the long-term colonization of West Papua. And to explain it, I will delve a bit more into the history of West Papua. Next slide, please. So the first encounter with foreign colonizers was already in 1526 with the Portuguese, and they gave the name to the island, the Ilhas das Papuas. So there is the name Papua came from. Later on, because at first there was no interest in West Papua, it was difficult to access, and at the time species were wanted by for instance the Dutch East Indies Company, and those were not to be found in West Papua. So several foreign colonizers tried to govern over West Papua, the Netherlands, the Germans, the Australians, and at some point the Dutch established a post on the south coast in Manokwari, and that was in 1898. And in the consultation between the Germans, Australia, and and the Netherlands, the island was divided in two halves with an arbitrary straight line along the 141st parallel. But after World War II, the decolonization period started, and Indonesia proclaimed its independence in 1945. The Dutch were hesitant to recognize the independence, so first in 1949 it recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of Indonesia, but West Papua was still part of a debate. In this Cold War era, it was decided upon that Indonesia should not become part of the communist bloc, and so under pressure of the UN and the US, the Dutch and Indonesia came to an agreement, the New York Agreement in 1962. And before that, it was the intention of the Netherlands to guide West Papua towards independence. So before that, in 1961, the name of West Papua was given, as well as an anthem and a national flag was presented by the New Guinea Council, a parliamentarian, kind of parliament, that was established by the Dutch. So in the New York Agreement, it was also stated that the indigenous Papuan people should decide upon their future in a vote according to the international standards. And already in 1963, Indonesia took over the governance, the administration of the Netherlands, and also military control of the territory. So from 1963 to 1969, there was a kind of campaign to win the hearts of the Papuan people, but they, I must say that they did that with a military oppression. So when the Act of Free Choice, which is known to the Papuan people as the Act of No Choice, 1,025 picked representatives voted in favor of annexation, but most of the time literally under gunpoint, to be part of Indonesia. From the UN reports from that time, and also from the report that was assigned by the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2005, it can be clearly seen that this Act of Free Choice was manipulated by the Indonesian regime. And also from that time until today, there has been repression of the indigenous Papuan people, and there is no freedom of speech. This has been escalating since 2019, when there was a racist attack on a Papuan student dormitory in Surabaya. And the peaceful protests that were held around Indonesia at that time were violently oppressed. Today, we can see only that the violence has been increased, and most of the time in the areas where there are mining activities. And it's estimated that at this moment there are in those areas around 60,000 internal displaced persons, mostly women and children, who have no access to food, healthcare, or schools. So, if we can have the next slide, please. There's a clear link between the state repression and the extensive exploration of natural resources that takes place in West Papua. I forgot to say that already in 1967, there was a contract of work signed between Indonesia and the US-owned company Freeport-McMoran to extract the gold from the Grasberg located in West Papua. Here on this image, you can see the open mine pit. It's immense. It can be seen from the moon like the Chinese wall. And it's not only, and this this exploitation or this mining, this leads to also to destruction of the environment in West Papua. And we can see the next slide. So there daily there are dumpings of 200 tons toxic tailings, and that leads to poisoning of the rivers, but also to deforestation. Maybe we can see the next slide. So here you can see the difference and the results of the poisoning of the river waters, which also leads to health issues of the local communities. And that also can be seen on the next slide, I think, yeah. And it's not only mining, but it's also the palm oil and the timber that are extensively exploited in West Papua. And that can be seen on the next images, but I will not delve into that. I think David can delve into that more later. So there are just a few images on the next slides, and then I will. My focus in the advocacy to fight human rights violations in West Papua and the environmental crimes is from an indigenous perspective. And although, if we can have the next slide, please. Although Indonesia is a signatory of the UN Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the right of free, prior, and informed consent is also enshrined in the Indonesian Constitution, and as well also in the Special Autonomy Law for West Papua. In practice, those rights are denied. And yeah, I hope that we can later on also speak about this together from what the solution might be. I think we have to also to take in perspective, and that can be, if you can show the next slide, thank you, is the fact that I think there is an unfinished decolonization. Indonesia and the Netherlands both are also signatories of the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Powers. And in the manipulated vote should be restored in order to have the indigenous Papuan people fully and freely exercise their right of self-determination. Maybe we can talk about that more in the plenary part of the program. I think I have to leave it here, and I'll give the floor kindly to Sylvia and David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fajar. That's a great introduction, and I look forward also to discussing some of the potential solutions on the last two slides, where we are. But now we'll hear from Sylvia Shejvar on patterns of gender-based violence in West Papua.
Yes, hello, and good morning to everyone, or possibly good afternoon if you are based in Europe, just like myself. And I would like to discuss some key findings from my ongoing research project, which is looking into the connections between environmental factors such as resource extraction and also increasingly climate change impact and violence committed against indigenous women, with focus on the situation in West Papua. And before turning to gender-based violence itself, I would like to start with something that Fajar was addressing, just to emphasize the linkage between colonial grievances and frustrated processes of colonization as we see it in West Papua, and how is that continuing to influence these violent dynamics targeting the indigenous communities in West Papua, with particular harmful impact of the women in that society. So I'm not going to go into details because Fajar has gone through all of that. I just wanted to highlight that there is a very close connection between this frustrated process of decolonization and the current situation in West Papua. So there is ongoing political conflict in West Papua. It remains rooted in this unresolved history of colonization, and continues to be fueled heavily by massive extraction projects such as the Grasberg mine, which Fajar has showed to you a few minutes ago, and also this massive scale palm oil plantation developments that Indonesia is engaged in. All of these extraction projects are characterized by the heavy involvement of military forces. And that has to do with the fact that indigenous communities often reside in resource-rich territories. And in fact, one of the former special rapporteurs of the United Nations on the rights of indigenous peoples has noted that resource extraction activities in or nearby traditional lands of indigenous communities constitutes the most significant sources of abuse of the rights of indigenous peoples worldwide. Because armed forces, state or private, they occupy those resource-rich regions to secure the extraction sites for their own economic benefit. And therefore, many indigenous communities live in militarized territories. So there are many UN reports, NGO reports, and other sources of information, credible sources of information, which points to the same pattern, that involvement of military and security forces in widespread human rights abuses targeting indigenous environmental defenders. So this conflict in West Papua intersects with ethnicity. So on the one hand, we see Indonesian forces occupying the territory and exposing them to very violent practices, the Papua community being exposed to violent practices. But this conflict and this situation is also intersecting with another factor of social differentiation, and that is gender. So, and that is the focus of my research I'm undertaking right now, is this nexus between gender, environment, and security. So the most disturbing form of violence which targets indigenous women is sexual violence, and its most common form is rape. But violence against indigenous women manifests in many different forms, including not only physical, but also mental violence. And usually women who are trying to protect their lands or their gardens, their direct environments, are mostly targeted. Majority of these atrocities is very closely linked to the extraction industry, such as mining project, as we see it in West Papua, or plantation developments. And a very disturbing pattern has emerged in these practices, and that's what we see, that gender-based violence and sexual violence also has become a method for the land grabbing. So to turn to these practices as we see it in West Papua itself, first of all, information is sometimes very difficult to find, for the reason that Indonesia prevents investigative bodies such as the UN or human rights bodies from entering the island, and therefore investigation is scarce. But we have quite a few UN reports and special rapporteurs, including also NGOs who have been reporting on these kind of practices. And one example of that has been pointing to many accounts of sexual violence flourishing around the Grasberg mine site, where we see that indiscriminate attacks against women were reported, which included also rape of girls and pregnant women even. For example, just to give one example, there were accounts of a repeated gang rape of a 12-year-old girl by Indonesian soldiers in front of her parents. And these practices are horrifying in itself, but it also has very harmful ripple effects for the victim, but also for the entire community. Many victims have given birth to children from rape, which results in a situation where both mother and the child are faced with intergenerational stigmatization, rejection, or marginalization by their families, which makes them in turn vulnerable to domestic violence. And that creates this practice of layered violence. So they are being exposed to violence both on the state level by the military forces which are invading their lands, but also on the domestic level within their own communities. We also see quite often that these practices create intercommunal conflicts between communities themselves. So sexual violence against Papua women and the heavy social stigma which is associated with this type of attacks that does not impact only the individual, but it also creates an attack on the underlying cultural norms. It constitutes a highly visible atrocity, which is utilized by the perpetrators to spread fear and terror among the population. So by the practice of forcing family members or community members to witness the rape of daughters, sisters, wives, that actually extends the heavy stigma attached to sexual assault to the family members. When young girls are being raped, that also has an impact on the entire family, because in many communities, virginity is considered as a high premium in the society. And when it gets lost during rape, then it destroys the community. So victimization of indigenous women is therefore utilized to debase the entire community to acquire and maintain positions of control over the natural resources. And the community is falling apart, they move away from the land, and then the land becomes available for the extension of extraction practices. So the key point from this I would like to emphasize is that decades-old colonial grievances remain very relevant for today's conflict. So we cannot consider today's attacks in isolation from what happened in the past during colonial or even decolonial times. Extraction projects continue to reproduce colonial structures and therefore aggravate the conflict situation. And gender-based violence, with sexual violence as one example of that, against women is very often utilized by the perpetrators to disrupt the community and force them off from their lands. So that is from me for today, and I would like to turn now to David, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Great presentation. Gives us a lot of additional issues. And now David is going to talk about the issues of climate justice in terms of this conflict. David?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce. And it's a real pleasure to be talking to you this morning / afternoon on this webinar. And I think what all I'm going to do is maybe reflect and deepen a little bit some of the observations that and the connections that have already been made. And some crucially important connections. We're connecting the aspiration and the right to self-determination with the human rights violations that have been occurred. You can't, we can't separate those. You can't separate those from the form of industrial development, predatory extractivism, and you can't separate those from the gender violence, as we've just heard from Sylvia. So I think one of the things maybe that we need to kind of contemplate, from you know, Guy, I'm assuming that many people in this audience are lawyers, and we work within the laws. That one thing that the law does very well is separate these things into very distinct categories, and sometimes that means it's very difficult for us to, makes the solutions to some of these problems a little bit more difficult. So I think that might be a place that I would like to get to in this discussion, if we have time, is to think about those deep connections across political dimensions, the economic dimensions of development, as well as the kind of gendered aspects that we can respond to as lawyers, or as people working within the law. The other thing I would add to this, of course, there's a racialized dimension to this that Fajar kind of introduced a little bit, but I think is for a lot of commentators is still there, and in many ways is intensified by extractivism, predatory industrial development, because a lot of the things that we've heard about, the state responses, security responses, are justified through very old racist tropes, and a number of academics have written about how the stereotype of Papuans is prevalent in state discussion, state discourse, as a way of legitimizing state violence. So the idea that Papuans are primitive, warmongers, are not amenable to, or are morally inferior, is something that a number of commentators have written about. And of course, we can't escape that part of this process that we're talking about is a settler colonial project, in which populations, local populations, indigenous populations, are being displaced, as both Fajar and Sylvia have outlined. So there's a very racialized dimension to this that we have to take into account as well. And I want to say that, that what we've kind of heard is that just the sheer brutality of the extractive economy in Indonesia, we simply cannot separate it from from political aspirations, and also from the ways in which we respond. I think one of the difficulties with thinking about climate crime and thinking about environmental crimes is that in the context of a lot of the things we're talking about, of course, there are some horrific and things that we would probably describe as offences or illegalities in some respect are actually the normal path of development, in not just in West Papua but in so many countries. And I'll come on to reflecting on these. I want to say something a bit more about palm oil. In fact, yesterday at the Indonesian Supreme Court, there were activists from the Oyu and the Moi communities who are asking for the palm oil development of palm oil on their land to be suspended. And so this is something that's very live and it's very ongoing. And I think it's important to recognize that Indonesia is the biggest exporter of palm oil in the world. 58% of palm oil in the global market comes from Indonesia. And in many ways, that's expanding. There was a moratorium 3 years ago on new palm oil plantations, but that moratorium no longer exists. And in fact, last year it looked like there was a real surge, and that's been sustained in palm oil plantations. And actually, West Papua is one of the areas where the surge is the greatest. Probably Kalimantan and West Papua are the areas that Indonesia is earmarking for rapid development. So this is something that we've heard is crucially important. The Trans-Papuan Highway is a major area of conflict, and it's a major area of conflict because it's the biggest infrastructural project in West Papua's history. On its completion, it would be 2,700 miles long, and that's tearing through that part of the island in order to open up largely, not just palm oil, but largely palm oil. It's estimated that around 83% of palm oil expansion results in the loss of forestry, so the loss of primary forests. And the implications of that are, of course, huge. It means that I mean, this is very well documented across the world. What happens with palm oil plantation? You get soil erosion, you get the depletion of water, you get the poisoning of water sources, you get the destruction of biodiversity. I mean, if anyone's ever been to a palm oil plantation, it's like a dead zone. I mean, really, there is no biodiversity. And so the other crucial thing is that we don't normally recognize it, but palm oil plantations lead to a huge amount of a huge loss of forest cover. So we lose the carbon sink when we replace primary rainforests with palm oil. And so I think it's important to recognize that the construction of the Trans-Papuan Highway is strongly resisted in a number of communities, and that's because they can see precisely what I've described happening in the palm oil industry. I think we have to underline Indonesia's current expansion and its focus on West Papua, because in the past few years, Indonesia has licensed licensed palm oil plantations, which are on average twice the size of those in other regions of Indonesia. So this is clearly a very specific issue for West Papua that we need to take seriously. I'm going to talk about mining for a moment, but we've heard quite a lot about the Grasberg mine. I won't dwell on that, except to say that in the Grasberg mine, we're probably talking now about 130, according to satellite images, 130 square kilometers of land has been affected by phosphate, cyanide, iron, zinc, copper in those toxic tailings. And we know, we've heard from both Fajar and Sylvia what the devastating environmental consequences of that. And I do want to say that this is not just a kind of natural consequence of what happens when you have one of the largest copper and gold mines in the world, but Freeport has been pumping those tailings directly into the Ajqua River. You know, this is not something. This is something that certainly could have been avoided. But the scale of the devastation is, there's a level of intent and deliberate acts that have to be discussed and have to be uncovered in that sense. And I know that there have been a number of cases that have sought to do that. We maybe come on to talk about those. But I want to say generally, I mean, this was a really powerful statistic from Fajar about 60,000 people being displaced from mining, from other forms of mining at the moment. And Amnesty International has done quite a lot of work on the Wabu block, the new huge gold mine that's been opened up in just a year. In Amnesty's study between 2020 and 2021, there were 12 people who had been killed, or at least as they described it, 12 cases of suspected unlawful killing in connection to security forces around the Wabu block. There's been a lot of evidence of other areas where there's a connection between fairly serious military attacks on villages, which are leading to the kind of levels of displacement. So rocket attacks on villages, not uncommon, have happened in recent years quite regularly, conducted by drones and helicopters, leading to the levels of displacement that Fajar was talking about. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the oil and gas industry, because another major area of conflict is in the Tangguh LNG liquefied natural gas plant in Bintuni Bay, which is largely operated by BP, not just BP. It's a consortium which also includes the Chinese national oil company Mitsubishi, but it's led by the British Petroleum BP, the British oil major. And that's expanding. It's expanding hugely at the moment. I think it accounts for about 20% of Indonesia's total gas consumption, natural gas consumption. It's going to rise to about 35%. And again, there's conflict around the expansion of that facility. The BP site disrupts ancestral grounds. It's almost like a story of the Grasberg mine that we've heard. Disrupts fishing villages. It's disrupted biodiversity in Bintulu Bay, and of course is opposed for those reasons. Creates conflict for those reasons. And BP gets directly involved. It funds security forces, and it relies on locally employed security guards at its plant. And of course, this we're back to exactly the same thing. And fairly, we could talk about some fairly prominent examples of what BP has been involved in its Bintulu Bay plant. Maybe kind of most notoriously, it was involved in Operation Sweep and Crush, in which over 140 people were detained at a particularly high point in the conflict, and 7 people were killed in extrajudicial killings. That was I believe in 2011. So, yeah, and the Indonesian government constructed a new military base near the BP plant precisely for those security purposes. So I think we get back to a point where, just to kind of conclude here, that we might sometimes talk about these things as climate crimes, and certainly there is unequivocally there's a recent case that's currently ongoing that the London Mining Network are involved in, that's arguing that the managers of the Grasberg mine have been committing offences because they are not applying the same standards, the same environmental standards that they would be doing in their home countries when they're operating in the host countries or anything like it. So we can describe some of these things that I've talked about, I think, unequivocally as crimes. Some of them we can't, but we can talk about them in terms of that kind of conflict, that complex relationship, always with human rights violations, with gender violence, with also racialized violence. And I think we need to think about how at the heart of this is an attempt at extraction, predatory extractivism, but what we're extracting here is value, or what the Freeports and the BPs and the Unilever, where much of the world's palm oil ends up in, those corporations are accumulating value, which is based upon denying the right to self-determination, which is based upon human rights violations, which is based upon extrajudicial killings, racialized and gender violence. And so even if we can't directly describe those as climate crimes, I would, and I think we need to broaden our understanding of how we think about climate crime, and I think that would be the kind of point that I want to end on. Although certainly I believe there is a lot of scope for legal responses and legal action in response to some of the things that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And I mean, your conclusion is a great segue to, what are the potential legal responses that the international community or NGOs can make. Like Fajar mentioned the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She mentioned the Indonesian Constitution, the Special Autonomy Law, number 21 of 2001, and the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Powers, the UN General Assembly Resolution of 1960. But, who wants to comment on to what extent can any of these be effectively used?
Yes, if I may. The hardest thing to notice is that the indigenous Papuan people or indigenous peoples around the world are mostly not in the position to have guarantees of the rights that are enshrined most of the time in international law or national law, so, as is in the case of the West Papuan people. So that forces indigenous peoples to play on several chessboards, right? So at the moment, we are advocating towards UN, trying to inform them about what's going on. And Papuan NGOs in West Papua are having also success in some cases that they have before national courts. So that's a good thing, I guess. For me, and like we concluded, the crimes are also intertwined with with the fact that they cannot decide upon their own natural resources, right? So the land grabbing, the denial of free prior and informed consent, and that's a strange thing to notice, also because of the fact that it's now almost generally acknowledged that indigenous people are the guardians of the biodiversity, are the guardians of our rainforest, lung of the earth, and that even the indigenous knowledge is also valuable in seeking those solutions for fighting environmental degradation. But they don't have a seat at the table. So I think there is where we have to find solutions. We as lawyers with Papuan roots, we think that it's all also, and the answer is also rooted in the fact that the decolonization wasn't completed as it should have been. There was a Papuan lawyer group that also brought that case before the Indonesian Constitutional Court, saying that the act of free choice was performed in contradiction with the Indonesian Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court decided that they couldn't give a verdict because it was performed under international law, under the UN auspicion. So that's something also that is still, like I said, unfinished business. So that's...
So Sylvia or David, do you want to say anything about potential legal initiatives, either pending or potential, to resolve some of these important issues?
Well, maybe a few words about the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think it goes without saying it's been a major achievement, which was only thanks to tireless indigenous activism that it came to the adoption of this very important document, which was 25 years in the making. And it's been a very unique process because indigenous communities from different parts from the world were directly involved in making the draft, this draft declaration, the rights of indigenous peoples. But at the end of the day, this remains a soft law instrument, right? This is not a treaty. This is a General Assembly resolution, which does not have any legally binding force, which creates a problem already. On the one hand, this is a general problem. On the other hand, we also have quite a specific issue with regard to West Papua or the region of Southeast Asia itself, because this UNDRIP and the rights of indigenous peoples are very much based on settler colonialism experiences, which we don't see a lot in Southeast Asia and Indonesia, right? Settler colonialism is more about the American continents, Australia and New Zealand, where the settler states were established. But countries like Indonesia, they continuously claim that indigenous rights, indigenous peoples, that's great. We all support that, but we don't have any indigenous communities in our territories because we all native communities, right? We are all Europeans have left, and there has been no significant European settlement on the territory. So either everyone is indigenous or no one is. That's a common narrative we see in the region of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, of course, no exception to that. So instead of indigenous communities, they maintain this view that we don't have those in our territory. We have customary communities, but not indigenous communities, and therefore the UNDRIP and the rights in it don't apply to us, which creates a specific problem for Papuan communities and similar indigenous peoples across that region. So, having said that, there is definitely a great value of this document, if not for the longer process of creating a customary law, right? At the end of the day, even if it's not a legally binding document, the majority of the UN member states have voted in favor of this document. They adopted this document, which constitutes state practice and opinion juris. So hopefully we will reach a point that this will be undisputed customary law. Until then, application of it remains very much problematic and very easy for states to simply not apply that and not accept any obligations under the UNDRIP. Yeah, so that's the comment I wanted to make.
Okay, thank you. So, and David, you mentioned and you focus on the issue of the power of multinational corporations and their role in all of these atrocities. I know in the US, about 20 years or so ago, there was an Alien Tort Claims Act case against Freeport. But those have been more difficult now because the Supreme Court has really limited the ability to bring those. So, you know, you mentioned BP, Unilever, Freeport. How can the international community get the attention of these big players and try to get them to stop or at least cut back all of these atrocities, both to the people and to the environment?
I mean, one of the problems we have is much of this stuff is not particularly visible, right? So no, I mean, I don't think very many people know BP is in Bintuni Bay, for example, and we also don't know precisely which of the. We know at some point in the supply chain where the palm oil is, you know, and it's, you know, and which companies. We don't really know where it ends up, and that's also the problem with the metals. Although it's very clear that probably the most visible transnational corporation in all of this story is Freeport McMoran, because of its involvement in Grasberg mine. So I think it's very useful for all forms of action to make those things visible, and there are, you know, fairly ingenious routes that some have taken to try and make some of those things visible. And I think that's useful. But I think what's also useful, as you say, the Alien Tort Claims Act has become almost a bit of a dead end because of the Supreme Court ruling. And, you know, but there are other ways in which litigation can proceed. But I do think that one of the big stories here that we're identifying is the role of environmental defenders and the role of local people and indigenous people as environmental defenders. And really the story is that one of the reasons that the extrajudicial killings, the torture and the other human rights violations are going on with such an intensity is because the resistance is actually on the ground quite strong. So I think increasingly we have to think about strengthening the ability of environmental defenders to do what they're doing. And you know, that can take many many forms, but I do think that exposing the violations that are going on right now, it has to also be a story about environmental defense. I'm only using the phrase that both Fajar and Sylvia used, but I think we have to keep using that phrase because that's precisely what they are. And in the context of thinking about what this means, with, as Fajar says, the rainforest on the island of New Guinea being the largest in Asia Pacific region, but also the third largest in the world, it's of crucial importance to all of us that we empower environmental defenders. And that, of course, means the right to self-determination, but it also means taking practical action to make sure that their struggle is visible and supported. And you know, if we think about the law, sorry, very finally, that's something international law doesn't do very well, is provide actionable rights, or you know, the treaty that's there to support environmental defenders in what they do is the Aarhus Convention is maybe would be the closest one, and it's, you know, it's not particularly supported. It's I don't know how many signatures. Certainly, Indonesia isn't a signatory of the Aarhus Convention. But strengthening the provisions in those kind of treaties, I think, is an absolute priority for the international community in West Papua and everywhere else.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there is a real problem with trying to implement international environmental law. I mean, we see with the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, I mean, there's no enforcement provisions. Some NGOs, like the Environmental Investigative Agency, sometimes with the support of the Norwegian government, has conducted these 1-2 years of sting operations to reveal the corruption and environmental degradation that's taking place in different countries. And also, some of those reports expose the corporations that are intentionally involved in, you know, both the corruption and the violation of both international and national environmental laws. And those reports sometimes also have led to prosecutions by national, you know, enforcement groups. And so maybe, you know, one answer could be the need to do more of these environmental investigations, because, you know, as you mentioned, transparency is a big problem. If we don't know, you know, which groups are dealing with things like palm oil, then consumers or law enforcement won't have the incentive and the information to act. So what about, does anybody in the any of the attendees have any comments or questions? There's one new message. No, I don't. So now I've seen that in Europe there's an increasing effort to bring class actions against corporations. Has there been any effort with respect to this conflict to bring any actions against any of the multinational corporations that are involved in the extraction or the atrocities committed on the indigenous people? No? So, I mean, other groups that have dealt with the problem of environmental degradation and supply chain, of course, have been the European Union, the OECD, and even the G20 and the G7. So I throw this out to you. What about, you know, to what extent should we try to use some of these international organizations that have, been active in other areas involving carbon or involving conflict minerals, because, it sounds like, all of these things in West Papua are really conflict, either minerals or conflict timber. Anybody have any thoughts about
I
the
think with
prospect?
regard to international organizations, the key challenge there remains that states are members of these organizations, right? So at the end of the day, there is no political will to address the situation because these things we have talked about, this illegal process of decolonization, the continued conflict, the extraction project, the militarization of the land, the sexual violence, all of these atrocities in West Papua are very much supported by the economic interest of the Western states, right? So there's no political will to address the situation, unfortunately. And international organizations have been doing great things on various topics, but that's only if there is a political will to address a certain situation. But as long as that is not there, there's not much, I think, that we can expect from international organizations as such, simply because they are a platform for states. They're not a platform for the community. They're a platform for the states, for the governments. So I'm not too optimistic about that option.
That is that. So it gets down to, a problem of power.
Oh yes, very much so. It's these very harmful dynamics, extractivism, capitalism, racial capitalism. This continues to fuel this conflict and atrocities, and the political will is simply not there to address them, because there seems to be no option to address them in a way that economic profit can be maintained at the same level and increased, right? Because we still seem to be very much fascinated by economic growth, as if that is the answer to everything. And there's really time to move away from that. Unless we do that, it's very difficult to find an effective and sustainable solution on the long term to these type of problems.
David?
We really should, as an international community, be talking about a moratorium on development in the world's, as a starting point, in the world's most crucial areas of biodiversity and the world's most crucial areas of carbon sink. So I think, that it's not, it sounds like a very kind of radical thing to say, but it's not so long ago that the International Energy Agency was calling for a freeze on all new oil and gas development. I think that's still the position, right? And I think we should, I think that's crucial, as a different issue, but as an issue that would be beneficial right now to the people of West Papua and the struggles that we're talking about. A moratorium on development in the rainforest would be, and that's not something that's going to come from the G7, because of course, as Fajal's history told, it was the most powerful governments in the world that did the deal that has led us to this point, right? Not least the US government at its head. So I think that this will need a popular movement, and we have seen a popular movement on the streets demanding climate justice and demanding, specifically, probably more focused on the production of fossil fuels. But increasingly, I think that movement is aware that we also need to stop the development of the Amazon, the Congo, and of course the New Guinea, the island of New Guinea rainforest.
Exactly. So, and Fajwa, I want to thank you for your links at the end of your PowerPoint. Information is very important. I right before the program, I read now somewhat dated, the report by the Yale Law School in 2004 does an excellent job of documenting all the atrocities. Information is difficult because of the controls that the Indonesian government has placed, and they even have charged with crimes the Polish journalist who tried to, come into West Papua and document. They charge him with espionage, if I'm not correct. And so, yeah, just getting information is very difficult. And so, at least, I mean, this program has been recorded, and so it will be available to persons that are interested in the subject. And I'm going to, mention it on my LinkedIn. And I want to see first if any of the panelists have any concluding remark that they want to make before we finish.
Yes, if I may start, I want to thank the organizers, and thank you, Bruce, also for moderating this panel and the opportunity to talk about West Papua. It's as we all said, very, very important. And I would like to refer also to the report of the Simon Scott Center of 2019 here in New York, which warned for a possible genocide in West Papua. As we also noticed, the international law offers not many promising. It's not very promising that there will be a solution for the West Papuan people. If you also see how now the situation is evolving in Israel and Palestine, and despite the orders of the International Court of Justice, the destruction and the violations continue. So that's not so very much promising for the West Papuan people. We need the movement, we need to raise awareness, and I hope that the attendees to this webinar also will spread the word and will delve into information about West Papua, and will be our allies in raising awareness about the situation, and possibly also change together the situation, the devastating situation for the indigenous Papuan people in West Papua.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Sylvia, do you have any concluding remarks?
Not particularly, except for thank you very much for creating this platform. Indeed, I echo Fajr's sentiment in that it's very important that there's a possibility to talk about these situations and atrocities. So thank you very much for giving us a platform today to do that. And let's continue the discussion on different platforms.
Excellent. David?
I'll just echo. I think Fajar's summary was really important there, and I entirely agree. I hope this is the start of making people more aware and more engaged with the really what is a crisis situation in West Papua, and also to just echo the others. Thanks. It's a great privilege to be speaking to the American Bar Association International Criminal Law Committee. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And I want to thank the ABA International Law Section, especially the International Criminal Law Committee and the South Asia, Oceania, and India Committee, and also the cooperation of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. Thank you all very much, panelists, for your excellent presentations. And this is only a start. We got to do more. And so this dialogue will continue. Cheers.